The wide-open land stretched for miles, quiet and golden under the setting sun. The wind blew softly through the tall grass, carrying with it the sound of crickets and the distant cry of a hawk. A cowboy named Eli rode slowly on his horse, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the fading light. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. There was no one waiting for him at home. No warm voice. No child running to the gate. Just silence and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Eli lived on a small ranch a few miles away from the nearest town. He had built it with his own hands years ago, board by board, post by post. Every nail told a story of a man who once believed in family and in a future that was taken away from him. Since then, he had learned to live quietly. His horse was his only companion. The land was his only witness. Each morning he rose before the sun, worked until his hands were covered in dust, and came back to the same empty house every night. The people in town knew him. They saw him ride in on Saturdays to buy feed and supplies. He was polite, nodded when spoken to, and always paid on time. But no one really knew what was going on inside him. They called him the quiet one. He didn't drink with the men at the saloon. He didn't flirt or laugh loudly. He didn't tell stories about his past. And so he became like a tree standing alone in the wind, steady but distant. That evening, as he neared the edge of the canyon, the air grew cooler. A pink-orange glow spread across the horizon, and the shadows grew long and soft. Eli let his horse slow down to a gentle walk. He liked moments like this. The world seemed calmer when the sun was saying goodbye. It reminded him of the nights long ago when his father used to sit with him on the porch and tell him stories about the stars. Those memories were warm, but they were also a little painful. Time had taken many things from Eli. People he loved, dreams he once held close, and the smile that used to live on his face. As he crossed the narrow wooden bridge over the river, he noticed something odd. At first it was faint, almost like the sound of a bird crying. Then it came again, clearer this time. A sharp, high-pitched sound that didn't belong to any animal he knew. Eli's heart beat a little faster. It sounded like a cry, a child's cry. He pulled on the reins gently, and his horse stopped with a soft snort. The world around him went still. The only sound was the river rushing below and that small, broken cry echoing through the canyon. He turned his head toward the sound, narrowing his eyes to see through the dimming light. His gut told him something was wrong. He wasn't the kind of man to ignore such things. Without a second thought, he turned his horse off the trail and started down toward the riverbank. The ground was uneven and rocky, but he guided the horse carefully. As he got closer, the cry grew louder. It wasn't just a sound now. It carried fear. When he reached the river's edge, he saw it. A small figure was stuck on a large, slippery rock in the middle of the rushing water. It was a little boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, holding onto the rock with tiny hands. His clothes were soaked. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. The water was high from the recent rain, and the current moved fast, swirling and foaming around the rock. The boy was trembling, his eyes wide with panic. Eli felt a sharp pull inside his chest. The child didn't have much time. If he slipped, the water would carry him away. There was no one else around. No voices, no help. It was just Eli and that frightened little boy. He jumped off his horse, tied the reins to a tree, and scanned the river quickly. The current was strong, but not impossible. He had crossed it before when he was younger. He grabbed a rope from his saddle, looped it around a thick tree trunk, and tested it with a firm pull. Then he tied the other end around his waist. His boots splashed into the cold water as he waded in. The chill bit into his legs immediately, but he didn't stop. The boy's cry cut through the rushing sound of the river. Eli spoke softly, not wanting to scare him further. "Hold on, kid. I'm coming." The boy's lips moved, but Eli couldn't hear the words over the water. Slowly, step by step, Eli pushed forward. The water climbed higher, pulling hard at his body. The rope at his waist kept him anchored, but he had to stay steady. One wrong step and both of them could be swept away. He took his time, placing each foot carefully on the rocky riverbed. His boots slipped once, but he caught his balance and kept going. The boy's eyes locked onto him. Eli saw terror, but also a tiny spark of hope. That gave him strength. When he finally reached the rock, he reached out a hand. "It's okay. I've got you," he said in a calm voice. The boy hesitated for a moment, frozen by fear. Eli smiled gently, a warm smile he hadn't used in a long time. "Trust me," he whispered. The boy slowly let go of the rock and grabbed Eli's arm with both hands. Eli wrapped his strong arm around the child and held him close to his chest. The little body shivered against him. The water pushed harder as he turned back, but Eli planted his feet firmly and leaned into the current. The rope helped him, pulling them both toward safety. Inch by inch, he made his way back to the riverbank. When his boots finally hit the dry ground, Eli fell to one knee, still holding the boy. He was soaked, cold, and out of breath, but the child was alive. The boy coughed a few times, then wrapped his small arms around Eli's neck. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a thank you, but it said everything. Eli slowly stood, carrying the boy toward his horse. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around the shivering child. "You're safe now," he murmured softly. He didn't know who the boy was, but he didn't need to. He just knew saving him was the right thing to do. As he lifted the boy onto his horse, something made Eli stop. He felt eyes on him. From the shadows between the trees, a figure appeared. It was a woman. Her long black hair flowed down her shoulders, and her dark eyes shone like polished stones. She wore a traditional Apache dress, and the way she stood was strong, almost regal. She didn't speak. She just stared at Eli and the boy, her boy. For a moment, everything was quiet. The wind stopped. The river's roar seemed distant. The mother's eyes were filled with fear, relief, and something else, something deeper. She stepped closer slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her child. Eli handed the boy down gently. The woman wrapped her arms around him, pulling him to her chest, tears welling up in her eyes. She whispered something in her own language, her voice soft and broken. The boy buried his face against her neck. Eli stepped back a little, not wanting to disturb their moment. He wasn't expecting thanks. He had done what any decent man would do. But the way she looked at him wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of a mother who would never forget. She didn't say a word, but her eyes stayed on Eli for a long time. In that quiet space between the river and the fading light, something unspoken passed between them. A promise, a memory, a bond neither of them fully understood yet. Eli put his hat back on, gave a gentle nod, and climbed onto his horse. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't expect a reward. He simply rode away toward his lonely ranch. But as he rode under the darkening sky, his heart felt strangely warm. For years he had only known silence, but tonight something inside him shifted, a small spark he couldn't explain. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that this moment would change his life. But deep down, Eli felt that the wind that always blew through his lonely land had carried something new into it. And that night, for the first time in years, when he reached his small ranch, he didn't feel entirely alone. The memory of a child's arms around his neck and the fierce, thankful gaze of a mother stayed with him like a soft light in the dark. The stars came out slowly, one by one, over the quiet land, and Eli sat on his porch listening to the crickets, feeling something in his heart he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't just the night that had changed. It was him. Something had begun. Something quiet, deep and strong, just like the land he called home. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Eli stepped out of his small wooden house. The air was cool and crisp, and a soft mist hung over the fields. His boots made quiet sounds on the porch as he walked down toward the barn. Usually his mornings were quiet and predictable. He'd feed the horse, fix the fences, and work the land in silence. But this morning was different. Something inside him still carried the sound of a child's cry and the look in that Apache woman's eyes. He couldn't forget the way the little boy had clung to him, or how tightly the mother had held her son. That moment by the river had stirred something inside Eli that he hadn't felt in years. It was like a locked door in his heart had been opened just a little. As he worked in the barn, his mind wasn't on the hay or the tools. It was on the river, the child, and the woman with eyes that spoke more than words. By late morning, he saddled his horse again. He told himself he was just going to check the riverbank to make sure no one else had been caught in the storm's strong current. But deep down, he knew he was hoping to see them again. He didn't even know their names, yet their faces had found a quiet place in his thoughts. The ride was calm. The breeze moved through the trees and birds sang above his head. When he reached the riverbank, the water was calmer than last night. The sun made it shine like silver. He looked around carefully. For a moment, he thought the place was empty. Then a faint movement caught his eye. On the far side of the river, near the trees, stood the same woman. Her son sat on the ground beside her, wrapped in a light blanket. He was safe now. She was watching him closely, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. When she saw Eli on the other side, she didn't run or hide. She stood still, her eyes meeting his. Eli slowly rode down the path, crossed the bridge, and stopped at a respectful distance. He didn't want to scare her. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, a simple way of showing respect. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was quiet but not cold. It was filled with something unspoken, trust that had begun the night before. The little boy was the first to move. When he saw Eli, his face lit up just a little. He tugged at his mother's hand and she let him take a small step forward. The boy didn't say anything, but his eyes were wide and curious. Eli felt something warm stir in his chest. It wasn't pride. It was something softer, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Eli stepped off his horse slowly. "How's the boy?" he asked gently. He didn't know if she understood English, but he hoped his tone was kind enough to speak for him. For a few seconds, she didn't answer. Then she nodded once, slowly. "Safe," she said, her voice soft but strong. Her English was accented but clear. The way she said that one word carried everything: gratitude, relief, and quiet strength. Eli smiled faintly and nodded back. "Good," he replied simply. The little boy took another step forward, still wrapped in his blanket. He pointed toward the horse and let out a soft laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was full of life. It was the sound of a child no longer afraid. Eli knelt on one knee so he wouldn't tower over the boy. "You like him, huh?" he said gently, patting the horse's neck. The boy reached out a small hand and touched the horse's nose. The animal snorted softly and the boy giggled again. That small sound made Eli's heart feel strangely full. The woman watched the scene carefully, her dark eyes never leaving them. She wasn't a woman who trusted easily. Life on the land had taught her to be careful. But the man before her had walked into a dangerous river without a second thought to save her child. That kind of action was not forgotten. In her people's way, a life saved was a bond that could not be ignored. Eli didn't want to push too hard or speak too much. He just stood near the horse and let the quiet moments pass between them. After a while, she finally spoke again. "I am Nayeli," she said. Her voice was clear now, stronger than before. She placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "This is Kai," Eli repeated the name softly. "Nayeli, Kai." He nodded respectfully. "I'm Eli." Nayeli looked at him carefully as if trying to memorize the sound of his name. It was the first time they had spoken as people, not just as a mother and a stranger. It was a small step, but one that mattered. Nayeli then said something in her own language, speaking softly to her son. The boy turned to Eli and held out his hand shyly. Eli gently took it in his own, shaking it lightly as if the boy were a grown man. Kai laughed again and Nayeli's lips curved into the faintest smile. It was the kind of smile that carried quiet strength and deep emotion, something that didn't need loud words. As the sun rose higher, they walked along the riverbank together. Nayeli told Eli in broken English how her son had wandered too close to the water while chasing a small bird. She had searched frantically for him, but by the time she reached the river, the current was too strong. She couldn't get to him without risking both their lives. Then she saw Eli and the horse. She saw him jump into the water without hesitation. And in that moment, she knew she would never forget his face. Eli listened quietly. He wasn't a man of many words, but every word she spoke felt like it was carving its way into his heart. He didn't see himself as a hero. He just couldn't have left a child to drown. Still, the way Nayeli looked at him, as if he was someone rare, someone worth trusting, made something inside him soften. After some time, Nayeli picked up a small woven pouch from the ground and handed it to him. "Gift," she said simply. Inside was a small carved stone in the shape of a bird. It was smooth and carefully made. Eli didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to receiving gifts. "You don't have to," he said gently. But she nodded firmly. "I give. From my heart." Eli held the little bird in his palm and felt a strange warmth spread through him. He carefully tucked it into his vest pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. And he meant it. They didn't speak much after that. Words weren't needed. They just stood there by the river, with the sunlight dancing on the water and the wind moving softly through the trees. Eli noticed the way Nayeli's hair lifted gently in the breeze. He noticed how calm Kai had become now that he was safe. He noticed how peaceful it felt standing there with them. But as peaceful as that moment was, Eli also knew the world outside this riverbank wasn't always kind. The townspeople didn't often mix with the Apache camp. There was mistrust, whispers, and long-held distance. But in this quiet corner of the world, all of that seemed far away. There were no lines, no walls. Just a man, a woman, and a little boy by a calm river. Before she left, Nayeli placed a hand on her heart and then touched her son's head. She looked at Eli with a steady, serious gaze. She didn't have to speak for him to understand. It was a silent promise, a vow that meant something deep to her. He tipped his hat respectfully, watching as she and Kai disappeared into the trees. He stayed there for a long time after they were gone, the little carved bird still warm in his pocket. As he rode back to his ranch, the land felt different. It wasn't the empty, silent stretch it had always been. The sound of Kai's laughter and Nayeli's quiet voice stayed with him, like music playing softly in the back of his mind. For years, Eli had lived with nothing but the sound of the wind. Now there was something new, a memory that brought light into his quiet world. That night, as he sat by the fire, Eli held the little carved bird in his hand. He thought about the look in Nayeli's eyes when she said her name. He thought about Kai reaching for the horse. He thought about how something so unexpected, a cry in the night, had brought warmth to his life. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt that this was only the beginning of something that would grow, slowly and quietly like a seed taking root in the soil. He placed the bird on the small table by the window and looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter than usual. For the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel like a man alone. He felt like someone's path had crossed his for a reason. And deep in his heart, without needing to say it out loud, he knew that everything had changed the moment he stepped into that river. The next few days passed slowly, but something inside Eli's world had shifted. The quiet mornings on the ranch didn't feel the same anymore. He used to live each day in silence, just him and his horse, the sound of wind across the fields and the steady creak of old wooden fences. But now, whenever he picked up a bucket, fixed a rope, or rode across the land, he found himself thinking of that moment by the river, the small boy clinging to him, and the Apache woman's dark, steady eyes. He didn't know why their faces stayed with him. Maybe it was the way the boy had laughed softly at the horse. Maybe it was the way the woman, Nayeli, had stood so still and proud, as if her heart carried both strength and pain at the same time. Whatever it was, it followed him like a gentle wind. But the world outside their quiet meeting was not soft. The line between the town and the Apache people had been drawn long before Eli came to live alone on his ranch. There were whispers in the saloon, suspicious glances at the trading post, and old wounds that never really healed. Some of the townsfolk carried bitterness like dust on their boots. It stuck and never came off. And when they saw something they didn't understand, they turned that bitterness into talk. One morning, Eli went into town for supplies. The shop bell rang softly as he walked in. He picked up bags of feed, salt, flour, and a few small things he needed for the ranch. But as he placed them on the counter, he noticed a group of men at the back of the store talking in low voices. Their eyes followed him, not in a friendly way. He had seen that look before. "Did you hear about it?" One man said loudly, just enough so Eli could hear. "Someone saw him riding near the Apache line again." Another chuckled, shaking his head. "Figures. Man lives alone too long, starts talking to ghosts or worse." Eli kept his face calm, but his jaw tightened. He didn't owe them an explanation. He didn't tell anyone about Nayeli and Kai, not because he was ashamed, but because something that pure didn't belong to their careless tongues. Still, their words hung in the air like smoke. The storekeeper, an older man with kind eyes, handed Eli his change quietly. He didn't join in the talk, but even his silence couldn't stop the whispers. As Eli carried the bags outside and loaded them onto his horse, he heard one more line from behind the door. "A man's got to choose a side," someone said, "and I reckon he'll choose wrong." Eli rode back home with a heavy heart. He had lived on the edge of things his whole life. Not quite in town, not part of the Apache camp, just somewhere in between, like a man standing on a lonely bridge. But now, because of one act of kindness, the eyes of the town had turned toward him. That evening, as the sky turned gold and orange, he found himself back at the river. He didn't plan it. His heart just led him there. He tied his horse near the old tree and walked down the soft bank. The river was calm again, the water moving gently, reflecting the fading sun. And there she was. Nayeli stood by the water with Kai. She had a small woven basket in her hand and was teaching the boy how to collect smooth stones from the riverbed. Her long hair moved with the wind and her dress brushed lightly against the grass. It was a quiet, peaceful scene, so different from the loud voices in town. When Kai saw Eli, his little face lit up like the first light of dawn. "Eli!" he shouted in a cheerful, clear voice. He ran toward him, holding out a shiny river stone with both hands. Eli knelt to the boy's level and smiled. "That's a fine stone, Kai," he said warmly. "Strong one." Nayeli walked over slowly, watching Eli carefully. There was no fear in her eyes now, just a quiet watchfulness. She greeted him with a small nod and he returned it. They didn't need many words. Eli helped Kai lift a few bigger stones, showing him how to find the ones that were smooth and shaped like eggs. The boy laughed when Eli pretended to test the strength by knocking the stones gently together. Nayeli watched the two of them, one from the camp, one from the town, laughing like they belonged to the same world. It softened something inside her that she had held tight for a long time. But even as the river glowed with golden light, shadows still hung around them. Nayeli finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "People talk," she said slowly. "Town, not like us." Eli looked up at her, his hand still holding a smooth stone. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They talk." She looked away toward the horizon, where smoke from distant fires rose like thin fingers. "My people don't trust town," she continued. "Old pain. Long time." Her words were careful, each one chosen like a stone from the river. Eli understood. He had seen the looks, heard the whispers. He knew the world was quick to draw lines and slow to erase them. "I don't care what they say," he said firmly. A boy was in danger. I did what anyone should do. Nayeli turned her eyes back to him. For a moment her strong, guarded expression softened. "Not anyone," she said. "Many look. Few help." Those simple words hit Eli deep in the chest. He wasn't used to being thanked, not like this, not with such weight and honesty. She wasn't just thanking him for saving Kai. She was acknowledging something bigger. The three of them spent more time together that evening. Kai skipped stones across the water, laughing every time one bounced even once. Eli taught him how to throw them just right, and Nayeli watched with quiet pride. It felt natural. It felt warm. But beneath that warmth, Eli felt the pull of the world outside this peaceful place, a world that didn't like when two sides came together. As the sun sank lower, Nayeli suddenly grew quiet. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small piece of leather, carefully painted with patterns in soft colors. She handed it to Eli. "Protection," she said. "For you." He looked at the leather carefully. It was decorated with delicate lines and symbols he didn't fully understand, but he could feel the care in each mark. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded, then touched her son's hair gently. "When you saved Kai," she said slowly, her accent wrapping around the words like soft wind, "I made a promise in my heart. Apache woman, do not forget a life saved." Eli didn't fully understand what that promise meant in her way, but the way she said it felt heavy and real. He wanted to ask more, but Nayeli turned toward her camp as the last light faded. "Tomorrow," she said simply before walking away with Kai's small hand in hers. Eli stood there long after they disappeared. He could still feel the smooth leather charm in his hand. The whispering river seemed to carry her words into the night. Something had begun between them, something that both the town and her people might not accept easily. The next day, the whispers in town grew louder. When Eli walked past the saloon, a few men paused their drinks and stared at him like he had crossed an invisible line. One man leaned back on his chair and muttered, "Should have let the savages handle their own." Eli ignored him, but the words stung like cold wind. People liked their walls. They liked their us and them. And Eli was standing right in the middle, refusing to choose a side. That night, the stars came out again. Eli sat on his porch, the leather charm resting on the table beside the carved bird. Two small things, but they carried more meaning than anything he had owned in years. He knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could step back and live the quiet life he had always known, pretending none of this happened. Or he could walk forward and protect the bond he had found with Nayeli and her boy, no matter what the town whispered. For a man who had lived alone for so long, the choice wasn't easy, but when he closed his eyes, all he could hear was Kai's laughter and Nayeli's steady voice. And somehow, in that moment, the noise of the world didn't matter. He didn't know how the story would unfold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to turn his back on them. Not now, not ever. The river that had once only carried water now carried something else between them. trust, courage, and the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. The night was quiet, but Eli's heart wasn't. He sat on the porch watching the stars as they slowly covered the dark sky. In his hands, he held the small leather charm that Nayeli had given him, tracing the delicate patterns with his thumb. It was simple, but it carried weight, like it held a piece of her voice, her promise, her strength. For the first time in a long time, Eli felt like someone had seen him, truly seen him. Not as the quiet man who lived alone on a ranch, but as someone worth remembering. The world around them wasn't kind. Eli had seen the whispers in town turn into hard stares. The more often he rode toward the river, the colder people's eyes became. But even with that weight pressing on him, he couldn't stay away. There was something powerful about the way Nayeli spoke without saying much. There was something warm in the way Kai laughed whenever Eli showed up with his horse. A few evenings later, the sky was turning gold as Eli saddled his horse and rode down the familiar trail to the river. He had started to learn their small routine. Nayeli and Kai often came to the water at sunset. It had become their quiet meeting place, away from sharp words and watchful eyes. As he got closer, he saw them near the water, just like before. Kai spotted him first and ran toward him with a bright smile that reached his eyes. "Eli!" the boy shouted with joy. Eli climbed off his horse and scooped him up with a laugh. It surprised him how natural it felt, this small moment of joy. He set Kai down and gave a gentle nod to Nayeli, who stood a few steps back with her usual quiet strength. This time something was different. Nayeli wasn't just watching. She stepped forward closer than before. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her eyes looked deep into his. Eli felt his heartbeat slow, not out of fear, but because he could sense the weight of something important in the air. She began to speak slowly, choosing each word with care. "In my people's way," she said softly. "When someone saves a child, the bond is not forgotten. It is not only thanks, it is heart." Her voice didn't waver. It carried a kind of old strength, like the river itself. Eli didn't move. He listened. The sun behind her made her hair shine softly in the light, and the wind carried her words like a quiet drum. She continued, "A mother's vow. It is strong. You saved Kai, you saved my heart. So my heart, I give to you." The air around them seemed to still. The sound of the river softened. Even the birds grew quiet in the trees. Eli understood that she wasn't just saying pretty words. In her world, a vow like this was sacred. It was made only once in a lifetime, spoken from the deepest part of the soul. Eli took a slow step forward. "Nayeli," he said gently, "you don't owe me anything. I didn't do it for a promise." "I know," she said with steady eyes. "That is why it matters more." Eli didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to someone giving him anything that came from the heart. He had spent years alone, with no family, no soft words, no vows. People in town saw him as a shadow that walked the edge of things. But Nayeli was standing before him like he mattered. And that did something to him that words couldn't explain. Kai, standing between them, didn't fully understand what was happening. But children had a way of feeling what adults often tried to hide. He reached for Eli's hand and then his mother's, holding them both with a happy grin. That small gesture, innocent and pure, tied them together more strongly than anything else. Nayeli took another step forward and lifted something from around her neck. It was a small necklace, a string of tiny carved beads, each one shaped carefully and polished smooth. She gently placed it into Eli's hands. "My vow," she said simply. Eli held the necklace carefully, like it was something made of glass. He didn't fully know the meaning behind it, but he could feel it. It was more than a gift. It was a piece of her trust, her life, her heart. He looked into her eyes and said quietly, "I'll keep it safe." She nodded. "Not just safe," she whispered. "Close." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with soft orange and rose colors. Kai ran back to the water to toss stones, leaving Nayeli and Eli standing side by side. It felt strange and natural at the same time. Two people from worlds that were never meant to touch standing together like they belonged. But this vow wasn't just between two hearts. It would stir the world around them. That night after he returned to his ranch, Eli placed the necklace next to the leather charm and the small carved bird. 3 small objects, but together they felt like something new, a quiet promise, a bridge between 2 lives. He sat by the fire for a long time, staring at the flames, thinking of Nayeli's voice. "My heart, I give to you." But while Eli's world was warming, the world outside was beginning to push back. The very next morning, Eli was out fixing a broken fence post when two riders from town stopped near his gate. They didn't smile. Their horses kicked up dust as they leaned forward in their saddles. "You've been spending a lot of time near that river," one of them said, his voice sharp like dry branches. Eli wiped the sweat from his forehead but didn't look away. "River's been here long before either of us," he answered calmly. The other man spit into the dirt. "You know what we mean. Folks are talking. A man picking sides can get himself in trouble." Eli stood there quietly, hands still on the fence post. Trouble. That was what they called it when someone dared to cross an invisible line. But Eli didn't care about their invisible walls. He wasn't the kind of man to turn away from something real because of whispers. When the men finally rode away, Eli stood in the dust for a long time. He knew this was only the beginning. Later that evening, he went back to the river. He needed to see Nayeli not out of fear but out of something deeper, something that pulled him toward her like the river pulled water. When he arrived, she was already waiting, as if she knew he would come. He told her quietly about the men who had come to his gate. She listened, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She wasn't surprised. She had lived with that kind of division her whole life. "Your people talk," she said softly. "My people watch, but I am not afraid." Eli took a slow breath. "Neither am I." For a long moment they stood facing each other with the sound of the river between them. It was not a loud promise, not a big speech, but in that silence something strong passed between their hearts. Nayeli reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right where his heart beat under his shirt. Her touch was gentle but sure. "You saved my child," she whispered. "My heart is yours." Eli didn't move. The words settled deep inside him like roots in the ground. He covered her hand with his own, not to claim her, but to promise that her trust was safe. The sky above turned dark blue. Fireflies began to dance around the riverbank, tiny flickers of gold against the night. Kai fell asleep leaning against his mother's side, wrapped in Eli's old coat. For the first time in years, Eli felt something he thought he'd lost forever, a sense of belonging. It wasn't about the ranch or the town or the borders drawn by other people. It was about this small, quiet space where three lives had come together. Eli didn't know how the world would react to Nayeli's vow. He knew it would not be easy. But he also knew this: he wouldn't turn away. Not from her. Not from the boy. Not from the promise she had placed in his hands and in his heart. The wind moved softly through the trees, and the river whispered like a friend who had seen everything. In that moment, beneath the stars, a lonely cowboy and an Apache woman stood together. Not as strangers, not as enemies, but as two souls tied by something stronger than fear. And Eli knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something that would test their courage, their hearts, and their bond. But for now, as the night wrapped around them, they let the world grow quiet and held on to the one thing that was real: the vow between them. The days turned into weeks, and something gentle began to grow between Eli, Nayeli, and Kai. It wasn't loud or rushed. It was quiet, like wildflowers slowly blooming at the edge of a dusty road. Eli had lived a long time without a family, without laughter echoing through the wind. But now, every time he walked down to the river and saw the boy running toward him, his heart felt alive again. Every time Nayeli's calm eyes met his, he felt steady, like the world had finally given him a place to belong. But their bond did not go unnoticed. The town was a small place, and small places have quick tongues. At first, people only whispered. Some said the cowboy had lost his sense. Others said he was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But as time passed, the whispers turned into open stares, and stares turned into cold shoulders. One afternoon, Eli rode into town to buy supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store and walked in like he always did. But this time, the room went quiet when he stepped inside. The men near the counter stopped talking. One of them gave him a sharp look and muttered something under his breath. Eli didn't respond. He simply picked up what he needed: flour, salt, rope, and walked to the counter. The storekeeper, a kind man named Thomas, gave him a slow, worried look. "Eli," he said softly, "folks are talking. Some don't like that you've been keeping company with them Apache folks." Eli's hand froze for a second. Then he continued to count his coins. "They can talk all they want," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I don't live for their talk," Thomas sighed. "I know, but some of these men, they don't let go of old anger easily. Just be careful." Eli gave a small nod, picked up his supplies, and walked out into the afternoon sun. He wasn't afraid. He had spent most of his life on his own, and he had learned not to bend for other people's judgments. Still, he couldn't ignore the way the town was changing around him. That evening, when he met Nayeli and Kai at the river, he told her about the whispers. She listened quietly, her face calm but her jaw firm. She had lived with judgment all her life. Her people had learned to keep their heads high even when the world tried to make them feel small. She reached out and touched Eli's hand. "We are strong," she said softly. "We stand together." Her words settled deep in his heart. They weren't loud or fancy, but they carried a kind of strength he had rarely seen in anyone. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who carried her world with dignity. And in that moment he realized something simple and powerful. This wasn't just about a boy rescued from a river anymore. This was about two lives choosing to walk together, even when the road wasn't smooth. One late afternoon, Eli decided to bring Nayeli and Kai to the ranch. It was a big step. No Apache woman had ever set foot on his land before, at least not in the eyes of the town. But Eli didn't care about the town's invisible rules. He cared about the quiet way Nayeli's eyes softened when she smiled. He cared about the way Kai's laughter made his house feel less empty. When they arrived, Kai ran across the open field, chasing butterflies and laughing like the world was his playground. Nayeli stood near the porch looking at the house and the land around it. It wasn't grand or fancy. It was simple, a small wooden house, a barn, a corral, but it was Eli's heart. It was the life he had built with his own hands. Eli showed Kai how to feed the horse, and the boy's eyes grew wide with excitement. Nayeli watched them, and for a moment her serious expression melted into a soft smile. She walked slowly across the porch and ran her fingers along the wooden railing. "It is peaceful," she said quietly. Eli nodded. "It's quiet," he said, "but it's always been too quiet." Their eyes met, and no more words were needed. Over the next few weeks, Nayeli and Kai visited often. She helped him plant herbs near the porch. Kai built small piles of stones around the yard, pretending they were castles. Eli taught the boy how to ride slowly on the old horse, walking beside him to make sure he didn't fall. And at night, when the sky filled with stars, Nayeli told quiet stories from her people's traditions. And Eli listened like a man who had finally found something worth holding on to. The townsfolk, of course, saw. And though some stared, a few began to soften too. Thomas, the storekeeper, once saw Kai help Eli carry a small bag of flour. He shook his head but smiled faintly. "Well," he said under his breath, "maybe the world could use more laughter like that." But not everyone softened. A few hard men still muttered their bitter words, and Eli knew they might not stop. Yet every time doubt tried to crawl into his mind, he thought of Nayeli's steady eyes and Kai's bright laugh. He thought of the night by the river when everything began, and he reminded himself that some things are worth standing for. One evening, a small storm rolled through. The wind howled across the plains and rain fell hard. Eli's first thought wasn't about his fences or the barn. It was about Nayeli and Kai. He saddled his horse and rode through the storm to the river. When he arrived, Nayeli and Kai were already under a small shelter they had built from wood and hides. The rain soaked the ground, but their fire burned bright inside. Kai saw Eli and ran out into the rain to hug him. Nayeli's eyes met his, full of warmth and quiet strength. "You came," she said softly. "Of course I did," he replied. He sat with them inside the small shelter as the storm raged outside. They shared warm bread and laughed quietly at Kai's stories. The world outside could say what it wanted. In that moment, inside that little shelter, they were their own world. As the weeks passed, something else changed too. Eli began to notice how the weight on his shoulders had lifted. He had spent years feeling like a man who belonged nowhere. But now, when he heard Kai's footsteps on the porch or Nayeli's soft voice near the fire, he felt rooted. The empty house wasn't empty anymore. The quiet land wasn't lonely. It was alive. One warm evening after Kai had fallen asleep with his head on Nayeli's lap, Eli sat beside her on the porch. The sky was deep blue, full of stars, and a gentle wind moved through the trees. Nayeli turned her head and looked at him. "I once thought my heart would belong to no one," she said softly. "The world is not kind to people like us. But you came into the river that night, and everything changed." Eli didn't speak right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small carved bird she had given him, the leather charm and the necklace. They were still with him every single day. He placed them gently on the wooden porch between them. "I thought I'd live my life alone," he said quietly. "I didn't think I deserved anything more. But you and Kai, you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Nayeli reached out and placed her hand over his. You saved my child, she whispered, her voice warm and steady. And now your heart is no longer alone. The night wrapped around them like a soft blanket. The crickets sang their quiet songs and the stars shone down as if they were blessing the moment. In the months that followed, the world didn't magically become perfect. Some people still whispered and some still stared. But the whispers grew quieter as the bond between Eli, Nayeli, and Kai grew stronger. Eli no longer walked into town like a man carrying silence. He walked like a man with something to protect, something to live for. Kai grew taller, learning to ride the horse faster, laughing louder each day. Nayeli's laughter slowly joined his, and Eli found himself smiling more often than he ever thought he would again. The river where it all began remained their place. It wasn't just a river anymore. It was a memory, a promise, and the beginning of a new story. A cowboy who once lived alone and an Apache woman who made a vow had chosen to build something real, something stronger than whispers and older than fear. And when the sun set each night and the wind carried the sound of Kai's laughter across the land, Eli knew that the quiet man he once was no longer existed. He wasn't just a cowboy on a lonely ranch anymore. He was a man with a family, a man with a heart that belonged, not to the silence of the plains, but to the warmth of love that had found him by a river.